One of the greatest challenges to interpreting messages is that it requires more than just knowledge and motivation in order to interpret something as close to the intended message as possible. It requires something else, and that is social sensitivity. Social sensitivity is basically a combination of a variety of things, including one of the interpersonal super skills of flexibility, that is being able to take into consideration context and a variety of purposes to the communication encounter and adapt as the unfolding encounter occurs. Also, you need perspective taking in order to place yourself in the other person's situation to better understand where they're coming from, what pressures they're facing, their attitude, their emotional state. Also, you have to be attentive to both verbal and nonverbal cues and understand that you could be misinterpreting and try to generate as many meanings as possible. Now, while interpreting is used in a variety of contexts and with various types of listening purposes, really and truly we're focused more on aspects of interpreting in special contexts, such as those in which you are required to listen empathetically and when you're required to dialogically listen. Therefore, most of the discussion this week is focused on both empathic and dialogic listening. Now, when we start to look at interpreting, it can be quite challenging to define it. It's easier to really understand it as it unfolds. Interpreting is a process where you are trying to best understand how the other person has intended the message, but even more so than understanding, so you're moving beyond understanding to get to the emotional state, the attitude, the situation that the other person is in. And so there's almost a shared meaning that occurs between the two people. There are certain situations in which interpreting is highly valued, very much emphasized, and very much needed. And it especially relates to the relationship itself. When the relationship is highly valued, then interpreting becomes emphasized in that process. For example, in a relationship with a significant other, you're going to spend more time and effort trying to interpret the message and create shared meaning between you and the other person because of the value that you place on that particular relationship. Also, when the situation requires empathy and negotiating meaning and creating new meanings with the other person, then you're going to emphasize interpreting. Also, when the speaker has given a great deal of attention to encoding the message, that is, they've really spent time thinking about what they want to say, how they want to say it, because it's important to them, then usually you will also spend the time and the effort required to interpret something because you realize the focus and the attention that the speaker has given to the message. And then also, when the relational context is characterized by lesser degrees of social identity is when you feel social proximity to the other person, there's not a lot of social distance between you and the other person. And so when there's lesser degrees of social identity, then you're less likely to understand the other person, where they're coming from. So that means you have to spend more time focused on interpreting the message accurately. And especially in cross-cultural and cross-gendered relationships, there are a lot of differences that oftentimes separate those people that can create a lot of problems with interpretation. And so you really have to spend the time and effort in interpreting, which means that you need to develop some good skills in that process. Now, interpreting is personal, it's complex, it's multifaceted, and it's definitely negotiated. It's personal in the sense that it requires you to really put yourself in the shoes of the other person, to imagine all that they've gone through, what they're facing, so that's what we call perspective taking. It's complex in that there can be multiple meanings that can be garnered from a single message and even generated from the speaker from that one message. So it's a very complex process in terms of engaging in perception checking to know whether or not the meanings that you've garnered from it are accurate. It's multifaceted and then a lot of steps take place. It is in terms of it being multifaceted, requires a number of different skills on your part as a listener. It's negotiated also in that you have to negotiate meaning with the other person. There's a give and take to it, and it's a back and forth, so to speak, and that requires a lot of effort and time. Many people aren't willing to put that forth in listening encounters, and that has an impact then on the relationship, has an impact on the way the messages are interpreted, and it has an impact on the situation altogether. Interpreting and its intricacies are definitely evident in empathic listening situations, and that's what we're going to begin to focus on today. Now, there is a difference between empathy and sympathy, and some of you may know that difference, and some of you may not be familiar with it. Sympathy is more along the lines of trying to have an emotional response to another person. However, empathy is when you go beyond just an emotional response to really trying to understand the other person's feelings, attitudes, the situation that they're in, where they're coming from their own cultural perspective. It's quite difficult to engage in empathy because of the amount of effort that it requires to really place yourself in the other person's shoes. And really what we're thinking about here is other-centeredness when we talk about empathy. That is, when you approach the communication encounter with the other person, you have an other-centered view. You're oriented toward the other person. That is, that you're going to have to put aside your own selfish interests, desires, your own values, your own motivations, and you're going to have to focus on the other person. And if you think about it, that can be really challenging to do in any situation, even if you value the other person. It can be very difficult to shed yourself in order to embrace the other person. There are 3 different components to empathy that we're going to look at very quickly. The cognitive component of empathy is when you engage in perspective taking, and so you think through who you know the other person to be, and you try to put yourself in their shoes. Now, you've probably heard that phrase, take a walk in someone else's shoes. Well, that's basically what you're doing in the cognitive component of empathy. You challenge yourself to consider their experiences, their culture, their belief system, their values, who they are, basically, all that encompasses who they are. And there are a variety of situations when this can be very advantageous, but it is very difficult. The behavioral component of empathy is when you demonstrate that you're listening to the other person. And that means that you show them physically through your posture, eye contact, and a variety of other things that you're actually listening to them and that you value the relationship. You're going to be providing supportive and non-judgmental feedback in the behavioral aspect of empathy. And just some concrete ways that you can accomplish the behavioral component of empathy is you can have an open body orientation where you uncross your legs and your arms to show that you're open to communicate with them, and where you don't try to create barriers between you and the other person, whether it's a desk or a door that's kind of halfway open between you and the other person. Don't try to cover up any part of your body, like, for example, put your hand over your mouth or over part of your face where they can't see you or feel open to you. Also, your eye contact can be very important to demonstrating your empathy. You want to make good continual eye contact with them with occasional glances away, because you don't want them to feel like you're staring them down, because in that case they may feel judged rather than having empathy. And then also body tension and movement. You have to be careful, because when you start to fidget, that is oftentimes an indication that you're nervous, that you feel uncomfortable, or that you don't want to be there and you want to be somewhere else. And that's not a message that you want to send when you're trying to communicate empathy to another person. But you still want an active body posture that demonstrates to the other person that you're listening. So you want your shoulders back, and you want to orient your body in the direction that the other person is, and you want occasional gesturing and movement so that they know that you're not completely dead to the world. Also, you want minimal reinforcement of what they're saying. This is not agreement. Very careful here. Not agreement. You want minimal reinforcement of what they're saying through things like facial expressions and nodding. You can use things like uh-huh and yes, not to indicate agreement once again, but to indicate that you're listening to the other person. And then the final component of empathy is perceptive aspect of empathy. This is where you're really focusing on the nonverbal cues of the other person. You're trying to really understand their feelings and their attitudes, and this can be difficult. This is not something that's done always very accurately. Many times we're inaccurate our interpretations. You can engage in things like perception checks, where you repeat back your interpretation of their nonverbal cues and their feelings and their attitudes to see if they would agree with you or disagree with you. And so you can think of a variety of examples that may relate to displaying cognitive, behavioral, and perceptive components of empathy. Many of you probably in your own family relationships have had to show empathy when you struggled through maybe an illness of a family member, or you've probably had to show empathy to a friend when maybe they've struggled with finances or the breakup of a significant other. I mean, there's a variety of situations in which empathy becomes highly valued and highly important, and these are just 3 components that we've talked about that can help you to build your empathic listening skills.